October 14, 1942, North Atlantic. Through the periscope of U-615, Kapitan Lieutenant Ralph Kapitsky studied the clunky, rust-streaked silhouette laboring through the heavy swells. "The Americans have sent us a floating scrap heap," he remarked to his crew, unable to hide his contempt for the ugly duckling appearing in his crosshairs.
Gentlemen,
he viewed the slow, slab-sided Liberty ship as an insult to naval engineering. But Kapitsky didn't know he was looking at the weapon that would drown his U-boat fleet in a tidal wave of American steel. This is the story of how crude industrial logic defeated German technical perfection. The German Naval Command had a name for the Liberty ship: Kaiser's coffins. To an engineer in Hamburg or Kiel, schooled in the precision of Krupp steel and the intricate complexity of the Type 7 U-boat, the American EC-2SC-1 was a mechanical joke. It was a vessel built not by shipwrights, but by bridge builders and house framers. It looked like a brick with a pointed end, slow, slab-sided, and hopelessly crude. While Germany was obsessing over the hydrodynamic perfection of their submarine hulls, the Americans had created a dinosaur with good proportions, a massive, unrefined beast designed for a single purpose: to move 10,000 tons of cargo at 11 knots across a lethal ocean. The derision from German technical circles was clinical. They mocked the decision to use reciprocating steam engines, a 19th century technology, at a time when the rest of the world was moving towards steam turbines. They laughed at the pregnant appearance of the hull, which prioritized cargo volume over speed. But what the German engineers failed to realize was that this crude design was a masterpiece of industrial psychology. By choosing an old-fashioned engine, the Americans could source parts from dozens of small factories across the Midwest that had never seen a shipyard. By simplifying the hull into flat plates, they removed the need for complex steel-bending machinery. The Liberty ship was an industrial organism designed to be born in a factory and assembled in a port. The most radical, and to the Germans most amateurish, feature was the decision to weld the ships together, instead of using traditional rivets. German traditionalists argued that a welded ship would simply snap in half under the stress of the North Atlantic. They viewed welding as a shortcut for a nation that lacked skilled craftsmen. They were right about the risk. Early Liberty ships did suffer structural cracks, but they were catastrophically wrong about the logic. While a German shipyard spent months meticulously fitting hundreds of thousands of rivets into a single vessel, American yards were training thousands of laborers, many of them women who had never held a tool before, to operate electric arc welders. A riveted ship was a handcrafted masterpiece. A welded ship was a product. The mathematics of this crude engineering began to shatter every assumption held by the Kriegsmarine. In Germany, a ship was a work of art that took nearly a year to complete. In America, Henry Kaiser had turned shipbuilding into a 24-hour assembly line. The ugly duckling was slow, yes. It was unrefined, absolutely. But it was a juggernaut that used mass and power to redefine the rules of naval warfare. The Germans had pursued tactical brilliance through technical complexity, creating jewelry that was impossible to replace once lost. America had embraced industrial logic, creating a crude machine that was so easy to produce it could be treated as a disposable resource. By 1943, the German engineers who had laughed at these coffins were forced to watch a terrifying reality through their periscopes. The crude American dinosaur wasn't just surviving, it was evolving into an instrument of annihilation that was drowning the U-boat fleet in a flood of sheer, unadulterated volume. The laughter had stopped, replaced by the grim realization that in a war of attrition, quantity had a quality all its own. The tragedy of German engineering in World War II was its obsession with perfection. While American industrial logic was focused on the mathematics of production, the German high command remained trapped in a cult of technical brilliance. Nowhere was this more evident than in the construction of the U-boat. To a German engineer, a Type 7 submarine was a masterpiece of lethal precision, a silent, intricate hunter built to tolerances that made the American Liberty ship look like a child's toy. But perfection has a cost, and in a total war, that cost is time. The German U-boat was jewelry wrapped in a pressure hull. Each vessel required between 6 to 9 months of meticulous labor by highly skilled craftsmen in specialized shipyards. Every valve, every weld, and every component of the MAN diesel engines was fitted with the care of a master watchmaker. This obsession ensured that German submarines were arguably the finest in the world, but it also meant that Germany was losing the war of numbers before the first torpedo was even fired. By contrast, the American Liberty ship was designed with a brutal, unsentimental pragmatism. It was the antithesis of German engineering. While the Germans were handcrafting individual predators, the Americans were mass-producing prey so fast that the predators couldn't keep up. The statistics of this contrast are staggering. At the peak of production, American shipyards were launching a new Liberty ship every 8 hours. Think about that. In the time it took a German yard to calibrate the fuel injectors on a single U-boat, the American industrial machine had already vomited 3 entire cargo ships into the Atlantic. This was the mathematics of destruction turned on its head. The Germans were pursuing tactical quality, believing that a superior machine would always defeat an inferior one. But the Americans understood a deeper truth of modern warfare. In a war of attrition, quantity eventually creates its own quality. A single U-boat might sink 5 Liberty ships, but if the factory can build 10 in the same time frame, the submarine has fundamentally failed. The tragedy for the Kriegsmarine was that their perfect machines were being drowned by crude American logic. The Germans were building a limited number of high-tech interceptors. The Americans were building an unlimited tsunami. It was a collision between 2 incompatible worlds. One world spent months perfecting the curve of a propeller. The other world used raw, unrefined mass to redefine the very rules of the ocean. Failed Weibull Heinrich Müller, the electrical engineer from Siemens, understood this as he watched American power from the window of his prison train. He realized that German technical brilliance was a dead end when faced with the carelessness of infinite resource. Germany was fighting with the precision of a scalpel, but America was hitting them with the weight of a sledgehammer. In the end, the Pacific and Atlantic were won not by the most sophisticated designs, but by the most efficient production lines. Germany was crafting jewelry. America was manufacturing a tidal wave. And as every German commander eventually learned, no matter how sharp your blade, you cannot cut the ocean. In the war rooms of Berlin, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht relied on a traditional military equation. To win the Atlantic, the U-boats simply had to sink ships faster than the Allies could replace them. In 1940 and 1941, The mathematics of destruction seemed to favor Germany. The happy time saw U-boat aces racking up staggering kill counts, sending millions of tons of British and American shipping to the bottom of the ocean. Admiral Karl Dönitz calculated that if his wolf packs could sink 700,000 tons per month, the British Empire would starve, and the American industrial machine would be severed from Europe. But Dönitz was calculating based on European industrial standards. He was doing math in a world of craftsmen, while America had already moved to the world of the assembly line. The cold, hard reality of American production didn't just meet the German threat. It buried it under a mountain of steel. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards launched 2,710 Liberty ships. That is a staggering 38.5 million tons of deadweight capacity. To put that into perspective, the total number of ships Germany managed to sink in the entire Atlantic campaign was roughly 2,800. Think about the implications of those numbers. By 1943, the United States was bleeding ships at a rate that would have crippled any other nation in history, yet its total fleet was actually growing. The Atlantic had been transformed from a graveyard of ships into a high-speed conveyor belt. For every Liberty ship a U-boat commander sent to the bottom, the American machine responded by launching 3 more. The predators were being outbred by the prey. The industrial logic was relentless. A single Liberty ship could carry 10,000 tons of cargo, enough to feed a city for weeks or equip an entire infantry division. 2,710 of these clunky dinosaurs meant that America could move 27 million tons of war material in a single lift. This wasn't just shipping. This was industrial might rendered as a physical force of nature. German engineers, who had spent decades perfecting the sleek hull of a Type 9 submarine, were now facing a mathematical impossibility. A U-boat carried roughly 14 to 22 torpedoes. Even if a commander achieved a perfect 100% hit rate, sinking every ship in his periscope, he would return to port only to find that in the time he was at sea, the American yards had built enough new ships to replace his entire career's worth of kills. Failable Heinrich Müller, during his transit through the American heartland, noted the carelessness of infinite resource. He watched a single barge in St. Louis carrying more grain than his entire village harvest and realized the war was no longer about tactical skill. It was a factory war. The U-boat was a masterwork of precision, but the Liberty ship was a miracle of volume. By late 1943, the German admirals were no longer laughing at the cardboard ships. They were staring at production charts that looked like a vertical wall. 4.1 million tons of cargo delivered every month. 15,600,000 parts assembled by laborers who had never seen the sea. The American factory had moved to the ocean, and the wolf packs were being suffocated by the sheer weight of 2,710 ships that simply wouldn't stop coming. The mathematics of victory were no longer a debate. They were a death sentence for the Kriegsmarine. America hadn't just built a fleet, they had manufactured a tidal wave that no torpedo could ever hope to stop. In November 1942, German intelligence officers in Berlin received a report that they immediately dismissed as a clumsy American propaganda stunt. The report claimed that a 10,000-ton Liberty ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, had been built, launched, and fitted out in less than 5 days. To the engineers at the Blohm and Voss shipyards in Hamburg, who spent nearly a year meticulously crafting a single vessel, this wasn't just a lie. It was a physical impossibility. They believed that steel had a pulse, and you couldn't force a pulse to beat that fast. But the unbelievable truth was far more terrifying than the Germans could imagine. At the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, the American industrial machine wasn't just building a ship. It was performing an act of logistical violence. The clock started at 12:01 a.m. on November 8th. What followed was a synchronized chaos that looked less like construction and more like an industrial ballet. 1,400 workers swarmed the keel like an army of ants on a deadline. The air was incinerated by the blue-white glare of thousands of arc welders, creating a roar that could be heard for miles. There was no room for the perfection of German craftsmanship here. There was only the mathematics of production. By the 24-hour mark, the double bottom was complete. By 48 hours, the massive bulkheads were being lowered into place by cranes that never stopped moving. The German philosophy of shipbuilding relied on rivets, millions of them, each requiring a four-man team and hours of precision labor. The Americans had abandoned the rivet for the weld. They weren't fitting pieces together. They were fusing a nation's will into a single hull. The rhythm was relentless. Clang, weld, move. 250,000 individual parts, manufactured in 32 different states, were arriving at the dock exactly when they were needed. It was a conveyor belt that stretched across the entire continent. At 91 hours, the engines, massive 2,500 horsepower reciprocating steam monsters, were lowered into the gut of the ship. At exactly 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes, the SS Robert E. Peary slid into the water. She was fully painted, her boilers were lit, and her steam whistles were screaming a defiant message to the wolf packs waiting in the Atlantic. She wasn't jewelry. She was a raw, scarred, ugly duckling born from a fever dream of production. When the footage of the launch reached German military attachés, the smirks disappeared. They looked at the time-stamped photos of the workers, many of them women in bandanas, teenagers, and elderly men, and they realized they weren't just fighting a navy. They were fighting a factory that could produce a fleet in the time it took Germany to process the paperwork for a single U-boat. The 4-day miracle was the ultimate demonstration of American industrial logic, that quantity, when pushed to the absolute limit, becomes its own kind of miracle. The Germans had mocked the crude American ships, but as the Robert E. Peary headed for the horizon, they finally understood that you cannot defeat a nation that builds ships faster than you can manufacture the torpedoes to sink them. The miracle wasn't just that the ship was built. It was that, for America, this was becoming normal. The German obsession with the U-boat was an obsession with the craftsman's touch. To them, a ship was a singular monument, built from the keel up by master shipwrights who treated every rivet like a piece of jewelry. But while the Kriegsmarine was perfecting the past, an American industrialist named Henry Kaiser was inventing the future. Kaiser didn't come from a maritime background. He built dams and highways. He didn't see a shipyard as a place of tradition. He saw it as an outdoor factory. He looked at the slow, bottlenecked process of traditional shipbuilding and decided to treat the Atlantic Ocean like a Ford assembly line. This was the birth of prefabrication, a concept that felt like heresy to German naval engineers. In Germany, a ship stayed in its slipway for months while thousands of parts were brought to it. Kaiser flipped the logic. He broke the Liberty ship down into 250,000 individual components and subassemblies. Massive sections of the hull, entire deckhouses, and complex engine rooms were built in separate shops miles away, then hauled to the dock by gargantuan cranes. The shipyard became a final assembly point where these Lego-like blocks were fused together. To the Germans, this was crude modularity. To the Americans, it was the only way to win a war of attrition. But the real mathematics of production was hidden in a single technical choice: the move from rivets to electric arc welding. Traditional shipbuilding required millions of rivets. Each one had to be heated, hammered, and cooled by a four-man team. It was slow, loud, and required years of training. Kaiser threw the rivets away. By using welding, he saved 30% of the total labor time and reduced the ship's weight by hundreds of tons. Welding allowed for good enough logic to prevail. You didn't need a master craftsman who had spent 20 years in a guild. You could take a former waitress or farm boy, give them a few weeks of intensive training, and turn them into a welder. The efficiency was terrifying. A welded joint was faster to create, used less material, and allowed the ship to be assembled in a fraction of the time. While German yards were still ringing with the rhythmic, slow clatter of riveting hammers, American yards were silent, save for the constant blue-white hiss of the arc welder. This shift in technology triggered a systematic demolition of the Axis advantage. One American yard, using Kaiser's methods, could outproduce entire German coastal cities. German prisoners of war, many of whom were engineers like Feldwebel Heinrich Müller, watched this process in silent disbelief. They saw ships being launched so frequently that the harbor water never had time to settle. They realized that their precision was actually their prison. They were crafting masterpieces that took months to finish, while Kaiser was manufacturing a tsunami using crude welding and prefabricated blocks. The Liberty ship was a dinosaur, yes, but it was a dinosaur born from the most advanced industrial philosophy on Earth. Kaiser hadn't just built a ship. He had commodified victory. He proved that in a total war, the side that treats its fleet like a disposable product will always defeat the side that treats its fleet like a work of art. The ugly ducklings were the roar of the assembly line, and the German U-boats were about to be silenced by the sheer, unrefined volume of American logic. By early 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had shifted from a happy time for U-boats into a mechanical nightmare that defied German military logic. Kapitänleutnant Herbert Wohlfath, a veteran commander who had once stalked the waves with predatory confidence, found himself staring through his periscope at a sight that felt like a hallucination. In 1940, a convoy was a rare prize, a small cluster of targets to be picked off with surgical precision. Now, the horizon was a solid wall of steel. He watched as the silhouettes of the Liberty ships filled his lens, 10, 20, 50 of them, stretching from one end of the Atlantic to the other. To the German mind, which valued the elite skill of the lone hunter, this was a display of logistical violence. The U-boat was a masterwork of precision, but it was being suffocated by the sheer, unrefined volume of American production. The mathematics of destruction had become a death sentence for the wolf packs. Wohlfath's submarine carried exactly 14 torpedoes. Even if he achieved 14 perfect hits, an impossibility in the chaotic spray of North Atlantic combat, it wouldn't matter. In the time it took him to reload his tubes, American shipyards had already launched enough new Liberty ships to replace his entire day's work 3 times over. This was the carelessness of infinite resource manifesting as a weapon of war. German commanders began to report a profound sense of psychological collapse among their crews. They were hunters who had run out of arrows, facing a prey that was multiplying faster than they could kill. One commander reportedly radioed back to Berlin in a state of shock. "The convoy has no end. We sink them, and they are replaced before the smoke clears." The numbers told the story of inevitable defeat. In May 1943 alone, a month the Germans would remember as Black May, the U-boats managed to sink 264,000 tons of shipping. In any other war, in any other century, that would have been a crushing blow. But in May 1943, American shipyards launched over 1 million tons of new shipping. The Atlantic was no longer a battlefield. It was a high-speed conveyor belt. German pilots and sailors had been told that America was a mongrel nation, weak and incapable of sustained military effort. But as they watched the endless streams of Liberty ships, built by women, teenagers, and elderly men in ports that had barely existed 2 years prior, the Nazi mythology evaporated. They weren't just fighting a navy. They were fighting a factory that had moved to the ocean. The Liberty ships were ugly ducklings, yes. They were slow, they were crude, and they were cardboard. But they were the roar of a nation that had commodified victory. By the time the final U-boat surrendered in 1945, the statistics were final. 2,710 Liberty ships had been built. Over 4.1 million tons of cargo had been delivered every single month. The U-boats had sunk 2,800 ships over 6 years, but American industry had produced over 5,000 in the same span. The laughter of the German engineers had long since turned into the silence of the defeated. They had pursued tactical brilliance, but they were drowned by industrial logic. The Atlantic didn't belong to the hunter with the sharpest blade. It belonged to the builder with the fastest assembly line. The thunder of the American machine had spoken, and the wolf packs had been buried under an avalanche of crude American steel. The legacy of the Liberty ship is not found in the elegance of its hull or the sophistication of its engines, but in the brutal, unyielding logic of the assembly line. For years, the Kriegsmarine believed that technical perfection was the only path to victory. They built jewelry, while America was building a tsunami. They treated naval warfare as a duel between master craftsmen, but they were actually trapped in a war of attrition against a global factory. The 2,710 Liberty ships built during the war were more than just transport vessels. They were a 2,000-mile-long bridge of steel that stretched from the American heartland to the front lines of Europe. They proved that in a total war, the side that can absorb the most punishment and outproduce the enemy's capacity for destruction will always dictate the peace. The German engineers who mocked these crude dinosaurs failed to understand that a weapon's value isn't measured by its complexity, but by its availability. Ultimately, the Battle of the Atlantic was decided by a fundamental collision of philosophies. The Germans pursued the decisive strike through superior engineering, but the Americans embraced overwhelming volume through industrial pragmatism. While a U-boat commander spent months hunting for a single kill, a welder in California was fusing a new hull together every few hours. The ugly ducklings were the physical manifestation of a nation that had commodified courage and manufactured hope. They didn't need to be fast. And they didn't need to be pretty. They just needed to be endless. History remembers the sleek periscopes and the silent hunters of the wolf pack. But it was the slab-sided, slow-moving Liberty ships that actually won the war. They buried the Third Reich under a mountain of grain, steel, and ammunition that no torpedo could ever stop. It was a lesson in humility delivered by the blue-white glare of the arc welder. The Germans had mocked the crude American ships in 1941. By 1945, there was nothing left to mock. The thunder of the assembly line had spoken, and the ocean belonged to America. If you want to see how this same industrial logic turned a death trap into a legend on the ground, click here to watch our next video. Why German tankers laughed at the Sherman until 50,000 of them flattened the Panther.